What's up, everybody, and welcome back to this wonderful little slice of YouTube heaven that we got going on here. Today, we're talking about a recent purchase of mine that I've wanted for a while, and there was just something about it that I kept saying, I want it, I want it, I want it. And I found someone selling one finally, so I bought it. And I wanted to talk you guys through a little bit of the history behind the company, as well as why I chose the version that I chose. A couple weeks ago, I bought a Vox AC30 Handwired. I bought the version with the Alnico Blue Speakers, as well as the version that's a head and a cab. And I bought it used, although it's still in very good condition. It still has some of the hang tags on it from Celestion. And I got a pretty good deal on it. It doesn't look like Vox is currently making these. I don't know if they've discontinued them or just halted production. We all know COVID kind of messed a lot of things up. But overall, it's an absolutely ridiculous amp. It is insane. I love it. And obviously, it is hand-wired. Which means I paid a lot more for it than a normal AC30, and so I want to explain that. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about Vox as a company and kind of what it does. Now, I'm not the expert by any means, and I got most of my information from a video over at 5-Watt World, so go ahead and check them out. I'll provide a link for that. But basically, Vox was started in England, kind of out of necessity. It was started by Jennings Organ Company. And at the time, there were some laws that prohibited imports from America. And so there were all these guitarists in England who wanted amps, and yet you couldn't get Fender amps, which were kind of the standard in the late 50s, early 60s. So out of necessity from that, in 1957, they started to make amps. JMI was their head manufacturer for these amps. You may know a lot of Voxes are mostly called AC30s or AC15s, or, when the Beatles were using them, there was an AC50s, all sorts of nonsense and crazy wattages that came out. But we mainly see this AC title because at the time there were some amps that were being made that used both alternating current and direct current, and it was causing problems where people were getting electrocuted. So they used AC in their name to make sure people knew that they would not get electrocuted using their amps. As you said, the two most common ones that you see are the AC30 and the AC15. The numbers, of course, are respective to their wattage. And the AC30 has been a staple for years and years and years. Feel free to go watch the video if you want to learn more about the ins and outs. I watched the whole thing and I was fascinated by it. But ultimately, there's a couple things that I want to hit on. Number one is that in the early days of Vox, there was a ton of variation across amps. And there were a lot of weird things that made it so that they made changes that maybe didn't make sense. Like, for instance, when they were first being made, they were being made with EL34 tubes. However, they realized that they needed to get more volume out of them, but Jennings, the organ company owner, wanted to make sure that the amps stayed a certain size, and if they wanted more volume out of them, the chassis had to be bigger, and therefore it was too big for the amp. So that's why they switched to those EL84 tubes, which is what gives Vox their quintessential sound. And with that, there's other grill cloth variations, Tolex variations, right? They all look different, and it's really interesting. We don't start seeing the common, what people, know and love as the AC30 until about 1961. That's where we start hitting the Alnico Blue Speakers, and we have the top boost channel that comes into play because guitarists wanted more of that high-end chime that could cut through the mix. So there's a ton of variation, and then of course, by the mid-60s, we have the Beatles who are playing them. In addition to the Beatles, I was blown away by how many people started on these amps. For instance, Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, he started on Vox. Other notable names include Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Brian Jones, and Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, as well as Dave Davies from the Kinks. So, it's not just the Beatles that you know and love for this sound. After a lot of different things and selling and reselling and changing and trying to go back or trying to find something new, Vox kind of fell out of favor towards the end of the 60s. Now, there were still a lot of people who were using those original Voxes. Those people, of course, include, but are not limited to, Brian May, Bryan Adams, Keith Scott, The Edge, and those early chimey U2 records. It's all Vox. Vox continued to try to make amps, and over the years, they stayed in business. People still used them, and they still stayed great amps, but they weren't always what they initially kind of started out as in those early 60s. Then in the early 90s, a recession hit, and they decided to sell, and they sold it to Korg. And Korg took them and kind of started trying to return to the original setting. In the 90s, they had a vintage series that they created that was probably the closest that we've ever come to having those original 60s amps back again. Now, while the Voxes that you hear nowadays aren't necessarily recreations of those 60s ones, they are a lot better, a lot closer. And under Korg's stewardship is where we see people like Brad Paisley in the early days. He was rocking a Vox, and that was fun to see in country. And, we see a ton of people who are using them today, including Hozier, and countless others. One of my personal favorites that uses the Handwired series, and one of my main inspirations for going for the Handwired series, is Chris Robinson from the Black Crowes. Now that I've probably butchered a small portion of rock and roll history, Again, go watch 5 Watt World's video on it. It's fascinating. I love it. He also gives a link to a book if you really want to get into stuff, but if you just want a YouTube video, that's the guy. Now, I want to talk about why Handwired. I thought a lot about it. I played a lot of different amps and ultimately settled on the Handwired version. One of my big inspirations for going with the Handwired series is Chris Robinson from the Black Crowes. And there's something about his tone that I can't get over and I couldn't get out of my head, and was a big motivation in why I was looking at the Handwired. However, after playing both of them, trying them both out in different circumstances and playing, a factory C2 with Alnico Blues and then playing the Handwired, I settled on the Handwired. And the reason why was because if I plugged a Strat into a Vox, typical factory with Alnico Blues, it sounded pretty Voxy. And if I plugged a 335 into the same amp, it still sounded pretty Voxy. However, when I plugged those two different guitars into the Handwired, it felt like the guitar and the amp were working together. It felt like you could hear the character of the guitar as well as the character of the amp. And that was really what drove me to shell out the extra money. I would say that was probably 70% of the decision. I won't lie to you. There's a solid 30% of the decision that I made because it looks cooler, in my opinion. In addition to that, it just has kind of become a staple in a lot of people's playing. If you look at Vox's artist page, you can see that most of them have a Handwired in the background, not a typical factory one. Not that there's anything wrong with those factory ones, because like I said, it still sounded great and I loved it. But there was just something about the Handwired that, to me, made it worth the extra money. I'm not going to say it's worth it for everybody, though. If you're wondering what that Vox sound is, it has this really tight low end as well as this pretty forward mid-range, and then their high end is just this chimey, sparkly, beautiful sound that makes just about anything you play sound good, especially when put in a band context. That was one thing that always threw me off when I worked at a guitar store and these Vox amps would come through. I'd play them and I was like, it just doesn't sound as good as, your typical Silverface Deluxe Reverb or, Blackface Twin or even the Blues Juniors. And what I soon discovered was that those amps sound really great on their own because they have a pretty wide frequency range, whereas this Vox sounds incredible in the mix. When you put it in a band, it cuts through the way that it needs to, and then it pulls back where it needs to. And that's really what drew me to it as well, is it just had this quality. I know this video has been all over the place, and I apologize for that. And hopefully you enjoyed some of the sound segments and hearing what it sounded like. There's just something about it that I couldn't shake, and even though it weighs 90 pounds, I plan on taking it to as many gigs as I can because it's just magical. As usual, like and subscribe. Feel free to comment down below and tell me that I'm wrong, or tell me that I'm right, or give your opinion, because, this is a discussion, and I love that about it. So once again, my name is Mac Wright. We'll see you around.